Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My two guests today are Dr. Myles Werntz, who has a PhD from Baylor University. He's Associate Professor of Theology and Director of Baptist Studies at Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas, the same location that his university is named after. He's also the author of several books, including Bodies of Peace and the most recent, A Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence, which he co-authored with my other guest, Dr. David Cramer, who also has a PhD from Baylor University. He's the managing editor at the Institute of Mennonite Studies, sessional lecturer at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and teaching pastor at Keller Park Church in South Bend, Indiana. In this episode, we discussed all things related to Christian nonviolence, both things that are related to their book, A Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence, and also other things related to the topic. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only dynamic duo, Myles and David. All right. Hey, friends. I'm here with Myles and David. Hey, guys. Thanks for coming on the show. We both go back quite a ways. David, I mean, I came across your name and work. Was it through Justin Bronson?
Yeah, very well could have been.
I think that was the connection.
Because he was working on that. He was working on that book, A Faith Not Worth Fighting For, I think.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I actually wrote a review in the Mennonite Quarterly Review of your book Fight that right. I think you said has a new name now, right?
Yeah. It's Nonviolence, the Revolutionary Way of Jesus. Yeah. Are we? Have we actually met in person? I can't remember if we've met in person.
I don't think so. Just corresponded on email and social media and stuff.
Cool. And then Myles, we were on a panel together of was it nonviolence versus just war theory or something like that? That was a little intimidating.
Yeah. It's one of those one of the classic just war versus nonviolence panels. We actually talk about that. I mentioned that in the introduction to the book, that was one of the impetuses that really started. There were like a few things that came together that really, I think, pushed us to do this book. And me being on that panel was kind of the tipping point for me.
Okay.
In the just war, this is a topic that I read and write on a lot, so I know all the just war arguments and keep up with the literature and all that. But it was frustrating to me because it felt like the folks from the just war position had no idea what Christian nonviolence consisted of, apart from the Schleitheim Confession and like a couple of chapters of Yoder's Politics of Jesus. So
yeah.
It's just, and then David at the same time had just written this article for Sojourners, in which he mapped out what became the basis for the book, kind of offering a typology of the different ways in which Christian nonviolence had unfolded.
Well, I already have a bunch of questions, especially with that panel. That was an interesting. I didn't know what to expect wandering into it, and I would just kind of like you, was more convinced in my position, largely because of. I don't want to say ignorance, like that sounds negative, but there was like a lack of familiarity with Christian nonviolence. They just kind of seem to address base level, kind of surface level arguments of just pacifism in general, kind of like, it doesn't work or whatever.
Sure.
I don't know. It wasn't really theologically astute, And I remember getting into Romans 13 and some of the background there, and it was like they didn't even. I don't know. It was frustrating, but also encouraging because I was like, oh, okay, so I'm not out to lunch. But why don't we start with you, David? How did you, maybe a quick background about who you are and how you got into this topic, and maybe like for both of you, like tell us about that journey of becoming convinced that nonviolence is the best representation of Christianity.
Yeah, just a brief introduction to who I am. I'm a pastor at Keller Park Church, which is a Mennonite church in South Bend, Indiana. We actually just became Mennonite this past year, so that's a part of my story as well. But I also work at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. I think this mug I'm drinking from has the logo on there. And a lot of your listeners might recognize that name as associated with John Howard Yoder, who taught there for about 30 years. author of The Politics of Jesus, and that's a part of our story as well. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we get into the interview. But my role there, in addition to some courses on kind of Christian attitudes to war, peace, and revolution and related topics, is to work at the Institute of Mennonite Studies. I'm the managing editor there, so we do publications in Mennonite theology and ethics and all that. So how did I get here? I guess you could go all the way back to kind of pre 9/11. I grew up in a fairly conservative, white evangelical context. We went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, heavily involved in the youth group and all that type of thing. And at that time, junior high and high school, I would have considered myself Christian, Republican, American, all of those things, probably in about that order. And I think it was with 9/11 and kind of reflecting on that and kind of American Christian, especially evangelical response to that it started to raise questions in my mind about sort of that whole package deal of sort of God and country. And so through reading works in Anabaptist theology, then in seminary and beyond, started to come more in the direction of a nonviolent approach. I would have probably just called myself a Jesus-y pacifist or something like that. But a lot of that approach was influenced heavily by Yoder. And so I met Myles in 2011 when we were at Baylor together in PhD programs in theology and ethics. And we're both there to study Yoder's theology and writing dissertations on him. And around that time, some survivors and advocates sort of blew open the story that had long been kind of a well-kept, not so well-kept secret, I guess, about his own history of sexualized violence. And that had been something that I sort of had heard rumors about and heard different takes on, but not really let that sink into my approach to nonviolence. And so that kind of sent me on a whole new trajectory then of working out how does nonviolence relate to all these other areas of life, not just the debates between just war and pacifists, but also how we live our lives as Christians in the church, in our homes, and all that type of thing. So that's kind of fast forwarding to how we get to the book, a bit of my journey.
I'm going to ask Myles this too, but I'll ask you before you pass it over to Myles. Like, what do you think is the best argument against Christian nonviolence? Like, is there one kind of thing where, like, man, this one's tough? Like, I can see where people are coming from here,
Well, one of the biggest advocates of Christian nonviolence in the 20th and early 21st century is Stanley Hauerwas, who was a close friend of Yoder's, and he would talk about one of the best arguments for nonviolence being the witness of Christians and the witness of the church, especially as it lives out nonviolence. And so I think if we take that argument seriously, then I think we have to say the inverse is also true, that the best argument against nonviolence is when we see that fail to be lived out by people who are advocating that very view. So I think we have to take very seriously kind of walk and word together. And that's something that, we're still grappling with.
Okay. Yeah, good. All right, Myles, give us a little background on who you are, and I'll end up asking you that same question.
Yeah, so I teach theology and direct the Baptist Study Center at Abilene Christian University. Been here for about 2 years. Taught a bunch of other places. Preston, so you and I first met when we were on a panel together in 2015?
I think
so. I was teaching I was teaching at Palm Beach Atlantic in Florida at the time. So my journey into Christian nonviolence came, it really started, I think, in 2001 with with 9/11. I think that's not an uncommon story. So I was in a class. I was in seminary at the time. Was in an early morning class. The administrative assistant came in, told us we needed to turn on the TV, and so we were just transfixed for a couple of hours. And so after I walked out of the building that morning, I was walking to my car, not sure what I was going to do with the rest of the day, just because nothing really seemed like the normal thing to do. And just out of nowhere heard like the passage from Matthew kind of ringing in my ears of love your enemy. And I thought, this is such this statement doesn't make any sense in contrast to what I've just seen on the TV. It just seemed to be such an utter contradiction that I couldn't shake it, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. It was not that it wasn't that I grew up in a militant background. I mean, I grew up near an Air Force base, and I think it was kind of the presumption that that's how it worked. But it just never really occurred to me to even think about the question of nonviolence, I think, until that point. And so that then began just kind of a very slow process of sorting through these questions of what it means to be a Christian in a world which is surrounded in violence. Part of what we do in the book is talk about the ways in which violence is not simply kind of international geopolitics, but it's also kind of the intimate sorts of violence that occur within the space of relationships and around issues of sexual identity and all these kinds of things. So the violence from the highest levels to the smallest moments is just endemic within what it is to be a creature in the world. So
yeah, so I'm looking at the table of contents, and you have a chapter 8 is on resisting sexual and gender-based violence. So yeah, I think that's really helpful that this book covers a whole gamut. It's not just about public policy or warfare or even biblical theology, in and of itself, but you're trying to apply it to all areas of life. Would that be an accurate assessment and kind of a unique contribution of the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just a brief overview of the book. We're kind of laying out 8 different approaches to Christian nonviolence, and that's part of what Myles was talking about on that panel, where there's just the assumption that Christian nonviolence is this one thing, kind of this static view that might be associated with the Schleitheim Confession from the Radical Reformers or something like that. And we just think we know what it is. And what the book does is tries to blow that up and say it's not just a simple single thing, but it's actually this living tradition, that there's multiple streams that kind of merge and diverge in all kinds of different ways. And so we look at 8 different streams of nonviolence that you can find throughout the 20th and 21st century, and kind of what their underlying logics are, what their underlying biblical, theological, ethical kind of grounding is, and then how that lives out in the world. And so that last chapter on, we call it Christian anti-violence, which is resistance to sexualized and gender-based violence, isn't just like an add-on to traditional kind of discipleship-based Christian nonviolence that we might sometimes think of, but in some ways it's actually resisting certain moves within that kind of nonviolence. And so not all of these views build on each other. Sometimes they do, and we can talk about ways they relate or influence each other, but sometimes they're actually talking back and forth to each other. So the arguments aren't necessarily just pacifists versus just warriors, but sometimes it's an internal debate among those committed to something like nonviolence.
Right. So my audience is a lot of people listening, very, biblically centered, probably all over the map, denominationally, and even theologically pretty diverse. But I think, most people listening, the Bible's a big deal in their life. Could you, and you could tag team this if you want, but for somebody who's not that familiar with Christian nonviolence and how this squares with the Bible, give us a quick overview of your understanding of how the scriptures promote, Christian nonviolence. Obviously, you have, Old Testament's an issue. There's all kinds of warfare, even sometimes commanded by God. You've got certain temple cleansing passages in the New Testament and stuff. But yeah, what's your understanding of how the Bible promotes this vision?
Myles, you want to take a couple passages and I can
Sure.
add on some
Yeah.
things?
So I think probably the most familiar passage to your audience is probably going to be what you find with the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus tells his disciples to turn the other cheek, to pray for those that are persecuting them, to go the second mile. This is in some ways ground zero, in that it's the most explicit. It gives this just explicit warrant that when you're dealing with even those who are your enemies, this is how you're to do it. But I think it really goes beyond that. You have, once you get into, I think, the letters, then it's the undergirding assumption that we are to be truthful with one another, but we're to be patient with one another, that we're not to enact different kinds of violence toward one another. You have Paul describing kind of some of the abuses that are taking place in the churches as what we now would describe as forms of violence against, exclusion of people from meals, or the mistreatment of the poor. As the different chapters in the book will kind of touch on those and describe those as different kinds of violations toward other people. That the way that we engage with one another sexually, or the way that we engage with our economics, that these can all be forms of degrading and violent behavior toward another person. So even though you don't find as many explicit warrants in the letters of Paul, but it follows from the same premise that this is one of the undergirding themes of what it is to be a Christian, is to behave in this way in a world which will not frequently return the favor, right? So even if you engage in the world in a way which, following Jesus, exercises nonviolence, don't expect that it's going to work out well, right? Frequently it won't. But David, you want to pick up from there? I think we might have lost David.
He's mesmerized. He's just so. I wish people could see his frozen face on the screen right now. He's just staring off into the ether. Well, while we're getting David back, what about the Old Testament? That's typically, I would say, people go to various passages in the New Testament, but I think people take it as a given that God didn't just allow warfares to happen. That's one thing. That's the is, but there's also some right? Some commands in the Bible, Deuteronomy 20 and others, the Canaanites and all these things. How do you respond to that?
So I think the way that I typically respond to it is by taking a look at the ways in which early Christians interpreted those passages. So they interpreted it in a way that doesn't try to wave them away, and doesn't try to dismiss them, but they engage with them in a way that reads them typologically or spiritually. So one great example here. So you have an interpreter, Origen of Alexandria, who writes a commentary on Joshua. And so when he's dealing with these passages of, well, what do you do with, God commanding, warfare? He reads that and says, how we are to read this today is that we're to read this as a struggle against sin. We're not to take this as a new kind of an ongoing commandment to enact violence against our enemies, but in light of Christ, we now read these passages in a way which takes seriously the struggle against sin, but also takes seriously the commandment of Jesus to not do violence against our enemies.
Now, right? Origen wouldn't deny that is not a literal historical event that happened, right? He's not saying that.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that he would deny that. I think that he takes it for granted that happens.
Right.
I think there's a way of dealing with the Old Testament that would try to maybe mythologize it, or to say maybe that was just their understanding of what God commanded, but that's not I haven't read that in a minute, but that's not my remembrance of how Origen deals with that. I think that he just kind of takes it for face value and says that may have been what was appropriate then, but in light of Christ, that's just not on the table. So,
and we have, I mean, just to add, and this is, I mean, in my book, I mean, that's why I have 3 or 4 chapters just on the Old Testament, because I didn't feel comfortable, and I know I've got friends who take that interpretation that Myles, you articulated, that this they misheard God, or this is an Israelite way of understanding what they thought God said, but he really didn't. And I just I've talked with Greg Boyd about this, and because he takes, and I don't want to misrepresent his view, but an approach kind of like that. And I don't know, like even with the Canaanite command, the command to kill the Canaanites, and I think a good biblical case can be made that it wasn't every man, woman, and child. That's not because I'm comfortable with that. I mean, I am, but I think there's exegetical evidence for that when you look at the nature of the command in Deuteronomy 20:16-17 and its fulfillment in Joshua 10 and other passages where, and I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but we know that so you have the command in Deuteronomy 20, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Okay, seems to be comprehensive. And you have in Joshua 10, I forget the verse. Trust me, it's there. 10:30, I think, where there seems to be a clear statement that command was fulfilled. We took the land, the north and the south, the foothills and the valleys, according to the command of the Lord. And it seems to be very clearly referring to Deuteronomy. So whatever Deuteronomy is commanding, the book of Joshua says, we did it. But we know for a fact from the book of Joshua that they didn't kill everybody. So there seems to be some.
There's a little bit of hyperbole there.
Yeah, which is very common in warfare rhetoric in the ancient world, and common in the biblical text. A million men didn't march up from Ethiopia. In Chronicles or whatever. Like that just didn't happen. There wasn't that many people then. So yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but. Even still, even if it's not a comprehensive command to annihilate every man, woman, and child, even if it is kind of like take the land, slaughter a bunch of people, I still think that, I don't know, to say that, because they're rebuked for not fulfilling that. Like the entire book of Judges is premised on the fact that they didn't do that command, and then they ended up intermarrying with the Canaanites, and that leads to problems. And so you have this huge thread all throughout the Old Testament that is connected to this Canaanite, this command to conquer the land through violence. So if you say no, that's not really what God said. There's just so much. I think it just seems like that creates many more problems than it solves. David, you were gone for a little bit.
Yes.
Any thought? I don't even know if you. I mean, are you familiar with like Boyd's position, and I don't want to keep saying this because I have not read his book, so I don't want to misrepresent him. But how do you handle the command to slaughter the Canaanites in Deuteronomy and others?
I mean, I might get in trouble by some of my Mennonite friends for saying this, my peers for saying this, but I just don't think the Bible is, strictly speaking, pacifist. I don't think that's really necessarily what is required to commit oneself to Christian nonviolence. And so I'm sure you're familiar with like Christian Smith's work, The Bible Made Impossible, where whatever you might think of his overall take on it, I think his main point of like, what is the point of the Bible? What is it trying to do? Is it trying to answer every last ethical question for us, or is it trying to point us to God as revealed in Jesus? And then it's sort of our job as Christians to live our lives in response to that revelation. And so, I have Mennonite friends, and yeah, you mentioned Boyd. I'm familiar with his work, who do a lot of kind of exegetical hermeneutical work to try to make the Old Testament sound more nonviolent than I think it is. Okay. I think there are streams within the Old Testament that kind of present a way of unfolding into a nonviolent life. So, God also in early chapters in Genesis seems to be very upset with humanity precisely because of its violence. And so it seems as though when you look at Genesis 6, that the sign that the world had become so corrupt was the increase in violence.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems clear that there's some fall from an ideal that would have been a more, this vision of shalom. And then in the prophets, you see them kind of hearkening back to that vision and looking to sort of an eschatological realization of that vision. So I kind of go different, depending on the day of the week, kind of how I deal with those passages in Deuteronomy. Like, is it kind of what Paul does in Romans 12, where he says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So, basically, if God commands it, that's up to God. But unless we get that command, that's not up to us. And so the ethic that is presented there in Romans 12 is very much in line with the Sermon on the Mount,
right,
even though it's predicated on this somewhat violent, text of leaving vengeance up to God. But then you have other passages like in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, be perfect because your heavenly Father is perfect. And it seems like the ethic is one of imitation. And so it's trying to be more like God. And if that's the case, it kind of raises the question of if we're called to imitate God, is God nonviolent, or is God's quote unquote violence something that we're not, supposed to imitate because of our creaturely finitude?
Yeah, it seems, I mean, of course there's aspects of God's character that we're supposed to imitate, but also, I don't know, not to be to simplify a complicated theological issue, but of course we're also not to imitate God in certain ways too, I mean, and especially that's, I just talking to one of my kids about this the other day, and they had a hard time with it, and I never really did, like, vengeance is mine, therefore you don't take vengeance. And she's like, well, how come God gets to take vengeance? I mean, he's God, like he has a right to do whatever he wants. We don't have that right. So I don't know. We imitate God when he says, imitate me in this area, but there's areas what he explicitly says, you don't do this because I'm going to take care of it. And it just seems natural that like God alone would be the one that would execute judgment perfectly. He knows, no human would be capable of doing that. So I don't know. That's never really bothered me, but for me, it was, if you ask the question, is there any evidence that Christians, okay, so now we're dealing with a new covenant ethic. We know clearly there are ethical differences and trajectories between the old covenant and new, right? There's things permitted in the old that are prohibited in the new, and things permitted in the old, whatever, flip it around. I think I messed it up. That's just, and anybody that didn't go to church with a lamb on their shoulder agrees with me, right? There's certain things that the Old Testament says don't do that we're fine doing. So there's differences between the old and new. And for me, the leading question is there any New Testament evidence, any evidence that God wants Christians to use violence to confront evil? Like, so I know everybody's thinking about the attacker at the door, or what about China invades America? All these scenarios that people bring up. I'm like, okay, is there any evidence in the New Testament, which was written in the backdrop against a lot of evil and a lot of violence? Like, it was these were live options, right? Mm-hmm. Evil was everywhere, violence was everywhere. This is not like, oh, they didn't have these categories in mind. No, these are the primary categories that existed. Against that backdrop, against a very violent Jewish movement, is born this new brand of Judaism that morphed into Christianity. There's I don't see any evidence in the New Testament where God allows or desires or commands violence as a means for a Christian to confront evil in the world.
This is Howard Thurman's point in the first chapter of God of
Jesus and the Disinherited, or
Jesus and the Disinherited. That he makes the comparison between kind of first century Galilee and his own experience, and just said, the reason that Jesus can command this is because Jesus knows what it is to be disinherited, to be of the oppressed. And so Jesus' own experience of being in that situation where violence is a very real option and violence is just very present is what is what gives the credibility toward his statement about nonviolence.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's exactly that. It's not like this is an unrealistic thing because Jesus didn't know anything about, like, the intruder at the door or the attacker at the gate or whatever.
Right.
But rather the opposite. Yeah, but this is intimately known. So of course, and he still says it.
Yeah.
So.
And I would also want to add that Jesus is himself Jewish, and so he is, fulfilling an option within Judaism. I don't want to paint the, distinction too sharply between like the old covenant and the new, in the sense that there's not continuity there.
Sure.
This isn't a Messianite type of perspective, or supersessionist or whatever. Jesus is drawing on the prophets who are pointing in this direction already. And so I think there's development, however you understand development within Scripture. I think there's development even within the Old Testament as you move into the prophets, where even someone like Jeremiah is saying, like, hey, guys, we're not going to fight back here. We're going to trust in God for deliverance, and we're going to go and seek the peace of the city to which we've been called. And in their prosperity lies our prosperity. And so, Jeremiah very well could have said, let's form an alliance with Egypt to fight off the Babylonians, and he didn't take that option. So I do think there's continuity and difference.
And Isaiah too. I mean, I wouldn't quite call Isaiah a pacifist, but he's headed. Well, he is very. I'm not Isaiah, but the God revealed through the book of Isaiah. It's very anti-militaristic, and most people know Isaiah just through kind of cool quotes here and there, that are encouraging for spiritual living, whatever. But if you follow the storyline of Isaiah against its background, like you said, I mean, I think Isaiah, I want to say 31, like the command, don't go down and make an alliance with Egypt. It's been a while since I studied it, so I might be butchering it, but there's a lot of stuff there that doesn't leap off the pages because we're not familiar with the categories that Isaiah is working with. But I remember working through the whole book in preparation for my book, and I was just shocked at how anti-militaristic it is. I wouldn't quite say like if all we had was Isaiah, we would all be absolute pacifists, but there is a critique against military might, against going to war. And I don't think it's just like, don't go to war because you're going to get your butts kicked. Like, we have the whole story of Sennacherib and the slaughter, 175,000. Like, no, God can do what he wants to do. So it's not just, you're a weaker military force, therefore it's not wise for you to go to war. It's kind of like, no, let's stop this warfare thing, trust in God for deliverance. So it's almost like Isaiah and in Jeremiah and the prophets, like, well, this is what you said, David, that it forms this bridge between kind of a more violent, deeper Old Testament history and the Sermon on the Mount. The prophets give us kind of a segue to the sermon.
I think there's already some kind of gestures in that direction earlier on. So even in some of the books you cited earlier, Deuteronomy and Joshua, so kind of pre-United Monarchy, there are warnings about militarism and nationalism even then. So when the people come and ask Samuel for a king, he's quoting from Deuteronomy, blessings and curses, to say, like, if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get, but here's what it's going to lead to. And so I see a sharp critique even there of militarism. So I think the
all your kids are going to get conscripted.
Yeah.
So,
that 1 Samuel 8, I mean, they want a militaristic king, a king like the nations, right, who will go out and fight our battles. And again, if you compare that to what we know about other nations around the time, profoundly militaristic, and the king was the military leader, and then that's who they wanted. And so Samuel's critique is it's not just a critique of kind of this abstract critique of, no, God's your king, you don't want a human king. It's more specific than that. It's like, no, you want this kind of military leader with a military machine, and it's not going to lead well, but I'll give it to you anyway. And that's exactly what ends up happening. Okay, one more, and I want to actually get to some of the stuff in the book, but I have to ask. I mean, the argument I feel like I always get from like biblical Christians isn't really a biblical argument. It's, wait, you're just going to let your wife and kids get raped by somebody breaking into your house? Like, how could you? I've had more people get visibly upset at me when I talk about nonviolence, and it really comes down to this. Like, you're just going to let this kind of evil run wild. How do you guys respond to that argument? The killer at the door.
I mean, David, when you gave your strongest objection and said that it was one of, do Christians actually practice this? This is the one that I think about, is the suffering of the innocent.
Yeah.
Like, that's the question that gets raised for me. In the book, I think one of the questions that advocates for nonviolence wrestle with is what does it mean to be nonviolent and yet present within spaces of suffering, right? So it doesn't wind up being a zero-sum game of either you let evil go unchecked and run wild, or you take up lethal lethal means and destroy attackers. Like, it's not a zero, like it's not an on-off switch in that respect. So there's also sorts of folks that talk about the ways in which so one of the things that we mentioned briefly, but one of the things I think that probably would need to do more work on is the role of, say, restraint, or the role of deterrence, or the role of doing away with the things which are causing the violence. So in the instance you're describing, kind of the attacker at the door scenario, there's a lot of things that can happen between disarming an attacker and killing them, right? There is restraint that can happen. There is disarming the weapon. There is, there is putting yourself in the way of those that would be attacked. There's a lot of options which are on the table here, other than I need to kill the person who is at the door. Yeah.
David, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, I probably am going to push back on the way that question is framed, because it kind of goes to an extreme in order to kind of make a rhetorical point. And they're appealing answer head on. So in that book, we talked about your faith not worth fighting for. There's an essay in there by Amy Warhol and Kara Slade who talk about that very question. But to me, I would kind of say the attacker more often than not is already within the door. Most sexual violence or violence that happens is from someone in the house. And how is a church responding to revelations of that are happening all around us? And so we can kind of create this heroic sense of like, I would valiantly stand up and fight to save my spouse's honor or whatever in this extreme situation. But then when we hear stories of abuse happening within our church, oftentimes those very same people are resistant to doing what's necessary to address that in a real way. So that might sound evasive, but I think when 99.99% of those kinds of scenarios are coming from within the home, to look at the 0.01% as an argument against nonviolence, to me seems kind of like a bit of a red herring. So,
but how would you deal with the 0.01? Because yeah. I mean, theoretical situations, and not that this is purely like, we are speaking out of privilege a bit. I mean, this is more real for certain populations than maybe for us, but let's just say there is that, person who is storming the door. Like, do you think could be a place for violence as the lesser of two evils, or defense of the innocent?
I think physical constraint is one thing. I would say that I don't live my life in such a way to prepare myself for that violent encounter. So I don't stockpile guns in my house. I don't have any kind of violent weapon that I'm aware of. I'm sure I could find something if I needed to, but I'm not living my life as a Christian in such a way that I'm constantly, vigilantly preparing for how I'm going to violently defend my own life or my family. So in that moment, yeah, sure, I'll use some kind of force if that ever came about, hopefully to restrain that person and not to inflict violence on them. So I think Christian nonviolence can get conflated with sort of the historic non-resistance view, which is a little bit different, which is like we don't engage violence or the world or the attacker in any way. And historic Mennonite or Amish communities, some of them would adhere to that type of view. That's not really quite what we're doing in this book on Christian nonviolence. There's very active ways to engage violence nonviolently.
Yeah.
Peter Ackerman's sorry.
Go ahead.
Ackerman is a historian who has called title of something like it's as a new kind of force, and which I think gets at the heart of what the book is trying to do, is that nonviolence is not passive in the sense of withdrawal. I think that that's a common misconception of what nonviolence does, but it seeks to actively engage in a way which lowers the temperature, or it's better conceived of as different modes of peacemaking and what all that entails. So
yeah,
that's where
I like what you said about it's not a zero-sum game, like, and the way that question is often framed, not that scenario is intrinsically theoretical. Okay, that does happen. But the way it's framed, it is theoretical. It's like, wait, you're going to just be nonviolent and not stop the killer through violence? Like, whoa, let's paint a real picture here. Okay. So guy breaks in, he's dead set on, beating up my kids, killing my wife, raping my family and everything. How would I even kill him? Well, you used your gun. Well, I don't keep a loaded gun in the house. Okay, let's just say you have a loaded gun in your house. Okay, well, do you know the risk of a child dying with a loaded gun in the house far outweighs this scenario where I didn't sleep with some dude's wife. I'm not involved in a drug cartel, or like there's no reason why somebody would come in. Not that it can't happen, but the percentages of my kids being at risk with a loaded gun in the house go way far beyond the scenario you're painting. Okay, let's just scratch all that just to say, for the sake of argument, you have a loaded gun in your house. Okay. Am I a good shot? Like, I'm not a very good shot. Like, I'd be scared I would miss the guy and blow one of my kids' heads off or something who's standing behind. No, you're a really good shot. Well, if I'm a good shot, I'm going to shoot the gun out of his hand or something, Well, no. Like, you're a good shot, but not that. And all of a sudden, it just starts to get like, well, are we talking about the real world or not? Like, what if he's coming? What if he's coming in? He's storming through my house and bam, I'd pull a John Wayne, blow his head off. What if he was actually after my TV because his kid's starving to death and he's a homeless guy or whatever, wanted to go sell him? How do I even know he's dead set on? Is he a robot? Like, how would I know he's 100% dead set with no other negotiation or restraint that's going to turn him away from killing my family? He's pre-programmed to kill my family, and unless it just starts to get a little bit, I don't know. It's intended to be, here's a real life example, but it's like, it's kind of not. Like, you painted that really otherworldly scenario. Is that fair? I mean, I don't want to get lost in the weeds of it, and I don't like you. I don't want to evade. Like, I think it's something that really has challenged me, and people say, what would you do in that situation? I don't know what I would do. All I know is a person who's trying to understand the Bible to say, I don't have a verse in the New Testament or a theme or a trajectory or in my ethical authority that says, no, guy breaks in, bam, blow his head off. Like, I don't have that as far as I can see in the New Testament. So I don't know. Sorry, I'm taking too much of this. Is supposed to be about you guys. So.
Well, I just think, the way you kind of deconstructed the question itself sort of points to how it's based on a certain almost pathology, but certainly sort of a view of the world in which I am responsible for my things to protect my stuff. And I think when you play that out further, it sort of shows how maybe American Christianity has gotten into some of the dead ends it's gone because of that kind of perspective. So not that wanting to protect your loved ones is a bad thing, obviously, but when you kind of keep teasing that out further and further and living your life in light of that, I think it leads to greater kind of desire for control and all of that type of thing. And so I think if that's the foundation for your approach as opposed to the teachings of Jesus, then, you're already kind of off track a little bit. Like, tragedies do happen in the world. We mourn them. We try our best to avoid them as possible. But if we kind of make all of our life decisions based on that very remote possibility of a tragedy, I think it could lead us down the wrong road.
I'm curious about
the world is not a safe place, but I think that doesn't that we engage the world expecting. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think there's a lag time in the internet connection here, so that's why we're unintentionally talking over each other. Go ahead, and Myles, you were on a thought there. Just why don't you repeat it, and I won't cut you off.
So I think that I'm trying to remember what I was even going to say. I think that the world is a violent place. I think I don't think that you can. There's any way to avoid that. But it doesn't then follow that the way that you engage a violent world is with the return to violence. The world is it's not a safe place, but it doesn't then follow that you do everything conceivable to avoid danger that you could prepare for every conceivable eventuality. I think that's a paralyzing way to live. And I think Jesus fully acknowledges that the world is a violent place and it's a dangerous place, but yet this is the way that Christ has called us to live through it as a reflection of the God that we have been called to.
Yeah. I'm curious about your two chapters, well, all of them really, but chapters 5 and 6. So chapter 5 is realist nonviolence, and that might be kind of stuff we're kind of been talking about. But the chapter 6 in particular, nonviolence as political practice, because that's another question often comes up. Like, are we I don't know, saying that like nations should be nonviolent? Like, are we saying America should deconstruct its military? Like, is this even the design of a Christian ethic? Or I'm assuming, I don't know if that's what you're. Well, let me ask you, rather than assuming. I have the authors in front of me. Talk to us about chapter 6 and what's that chapter all about?
Yeah, well, there's kind of a progression throughout the book in a way from chapter 1, looking at nonviolence as Christian discipleship, and a lot of the questions we've been talking about today kind of would fall under that category. In fact, we mentioned your book on nonviolence within that chapter as part of kind of that approach to nonviolence as Christian discipleship. But in looking at 20th and 21st century thinkers, Christian thinkers, we've seen that some of them come at these questions differently. And it's not that they're not committed to following Jesus or don't follow the Bible, but it's maybe their entryway into nonviolence comes from a different direction than I read the Sermon on the Mount and now I'm convinced. And, your book, I remember reading it the first time and kind of being struck by like this sense of, you almost seemed as surprised as anybody else that like nonviolence is what you came to. Like, I like hunting and all this stuff, but here I am. What am I supposed to do? This is what the Bible says. But some other thinkers kind of come at these questions differently. And the chapter on realist nonviolence kind of arises from a challenge around World War II from Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a Christian realist, who said basically, like, if you want to follow Jesus literally, that's fine. Go be Amish or Mennonite. Like, we need those people to show us kind of the ideal. But if you want to actually make a difference in the world, you have to give up nonviolence. And so he creates a binary between absolute nonviolence and political kind of
responsibility
or responsibility.
Okay.
Yeah. And what we find is other thinkers come along after him and say, are those our only two options? Or are there ways to be politically responsible, to actually try to combat the evil in the world, maybe not to make nations pacifist, like you put it, but maybe to make them more just and more equitable? Are there ways that we can maybe minimize the causes that lead to war in the world? And can we do those things without engaging in violence? And so a lot of the thinkers in that chapter are kind of taking up that challenge of Niebuhr and trying to say, what are the things we can be doing now? Glenn Stassen's an example that we talk about in that chapter, where he talks about these nonviolent initiatives that can kind of help reduce the amount of violence in the world, help lead to a more just and equitable world, not denying that the world isn't Christian, nations aren't Christian, they're not going to completely lay down their arms, but maybe we can move it in a more just direction. And then Myles, I don't know if you want to talk about political practice a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So chapter 6, the political practice, it draws in, I think, some figures that would be fairly familiar. It talks about Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez, but it gets to this question of what is the role of nonviolence within the political process. So, I mean, this is going to be the one that's most familiar to, I think, to most folks, is the ways in which nonviolence functions as a form of protest or as a form of political pressure internally. So it pairs well with the chapter that David was just talking about, which deals more with the question of nonviolence as it relates to nations externally. So that it's not just people protesting in the streets, but it provides actionable ways to engage the world at large.
Okay. Do you guys have thoughts about Christians in the police force? Do you guys wrestle with that in the book? I get that question a decent amount.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that in your book, because wasn't your dad a police officer?
Yeah, he was LAPD for 17 years. And this was Richard Hayes, I think he said, was one of the more difficult ones for him. And I've seen, I've read among, the fairly broad nonviolent camp, different perspectives on it.
Yeah, so this is where, if you take kind of a strict view of nonviolence as not participating in war or not killing someone, strictly taking it as like bloodshed being what violence is and nonviolence being not doing that, then I could see some forms of policing that would still fall under that rubric. So like Gerald Schlabach is a thinker we talk about in the book, where he actually advocates for what he calls just policing, right, which is sort of an alternative to war, and it's sort of modeled on policing. But if you think of violence more broadly, which some of the chapters, like the chapter on liberationist nonviolence, we talk about how people like Oscar Romero view violence as not a break from the norm, but actually part of the norm. Like our lives are so enmeshed in violence. And I think if you take that approach, then policing itself might be a way of maintaining some of those inequities and some of those violences we find in the world. So even if they're not literally shedding blood, they might be a part of that system that could be violent. And so I think there's critiques beyond just whether they should carry guns or not, although, with the police shootings we see in the news frequently, we know there is that kind of violence as well. So the Mennonite church that I'm a part of has some curriculum on police abolition. If your listeners want to look that up on Mennonite Church USA, I'm sure it would be a very challenging read, but they're trying to pull in thinkers from Black and queer communities and others who are finding the police presence as a form of oppression. That's one perspective, but yeah,
that one's hard for me. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Because I mean, people will say I'm a hypocrite if, like, well, okay, even if you wouldn't be a cop, you would call the cops if somebody, right? Like you would, and I'm like, Yeah, I think I would. Is that but yeah, is that I don't know. It's hard. I don't know what to do. I mean, it is still to me not, well, it's not like the main question again goes back to, as Bible believing Christians, what does Jesus in the New Testament say about how Christians should confront evil? And then, all these kind of, what about this? What about that? I think they should flow from that paradigm. And I think there's some that are they're just tough, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I did a little bit of research on this for my book, I mean, gosh, it's been like 10 years now, but, I mean, we often think of our kind of U.S. American situation, which is very different and unique. And, there's, I think, other countries still today, or at least in the past, where, like police didn't carry guns, and it wasn't the question wouldn't have been as pressing for other forms of policing around the world than historically, compared to like the situation in America where there's 350 million guns in the U.S. and we have a very unique kind of gun culture, and we're built on a gun foundation, and it is a unique situation. All that to say, like the question is kind of specific for the American context, and is different if you apply it to other contexts. Not that it's completely different, but I don't know.
Yeah, Myles, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the apocalyptic nonviolence chapter.
Oh yeah,
just in the sense of how it creates just between the way of life, the way of Jesus, and the way of death, and how that might play into this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the streams that we talk about, and this is probably a stream that's not going to be known as it's not known as well, and it's probably not known to your listeners, is what we call apocalyptic nonviolence. So, got the book here in front of me. It is chapter chapter
4.
4. Yeah, chapter 4 of the book. So it centers on a guy. One of the key figures here is a guy named William Stringfellow, who did a lot of his work in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so one of the key theses here is that the call to nonviolence is not a withdrawal from the world, but it is an active call of God to dismantle those things which are causing death in the world. That the ultimate struggle here is, I mean, this is like deeply New Testament, right? It's like death is the final enemy. And so death shows up, and it manifests its powers within creation in all kinds of ways. That he calls this is what Stringfellow calls like the principalities. These are all emissaries of death in one way or another. And so the way that Christians deal with violence is by actively opposing those things which are causing death to manifest itself within the world. And so you have Stringfellow himself did not do this, but there were a couple of Catholic priests and a collection of other folks that would do things like break into draft offices during Vietnam and burn the draft cards, or destroy draft records, or would break into nuclear facilities and try to dismantle the various weapons. And so I think broadly applied, like this is a form of nonviolence, because you're not. It recognizes that the real struggle here is against death itself, and being willing to destroy those things which are proliferating death within the world. Interesting, yeah. And so when you think about it within the question of policing, it begins to ask the question: what are those elements within like order, like the way in which we think of ordering society? What are those things which are helping to provide some sense of regulation and order, and what are those things which are contributing to the death and degradation of people? Right. So it might entail some things. It might entail, not dismantling everything about law. It might not entail dismantling everything about providing people who are judges or adjudicators and people in conflict. It probably wouldn't entail that, but it probably would mean looking hard at the ways in which we do that. Are the ways in which we're thinking about an orderly society, are those actually contributing to the death of people? Are those contributing to the degradation and oppression of people? Right? And those would be the things from an apocalyptic perspective that you need to really dismantle. Right? Those things have to go.
Yeah, that's good. No, that's good. I wonder how much of I mean, isn't a lot violence wrapped up a lot with things like socioeconomic status and poverty and hunger and which that's there's got to be, I mean, there's got to be like more systemic questions and questions that need to be asked and things that need to be addressed if we're really concerned about, again, confronting evil, stopping the innocent from being oppressed. Like we're dealing with really complex systems of injustice that are wrapped up into that question, rather than just, no, the bad guy pulls a gun, you shoot him. It's like, well, okay, right. I don't want to avoid that question, but I want to set it in a more complex, real life, context. But
David, you want to talk about the liberationist chapter? Because that really gets into that
that's
question.
Where that question really comes to the fore. We focus on Latin American liberation. There's also Black liberation, women's liberation, so on. But our chapter draws heavily on people like Helder Camara, Oscar Romero, and others who are not saying like economics and politics lead to violence, but that those things can themselves be a form of violence. And so for them, nonviolence is about just what you were saying, Preston, like actively confronting those injustices, because those are forms of violence, and not just in an abstract way, but in a very real way, that those are leading to death. And I think that's been a big challenge for me in researching for this book, is that I came to Christian nonviolence, as I shared at the beginning, from a very kind of, the Bible says that I should do it, end of story type of perspective, kind of what we talk about of nonviolence of Christian discipleship. I'm still committed to that, but I've seen ways in which it goes deeper than just kind of a literal refusal to engage in bloodshed, but actually trying to identify where violence is in our society and how we can be actively undoing that. And so even the word nonviolence might itself be a little bit of a misnomer, because it sounds like there's violence and then we don't do that, so we're nonviolent. And I think that word anti-violence we used in the last chapter might be kind of the direction that I'm moving, where it's more about what are we as Christians doing to seek justice, to seek peace in the world, and how can we undo those violences all around us?
Yeah, no, that's good. I like that. That's or even Ron Sider, he's got that book that documents kind of all the non-violent revolts against systems of oppression when people tried to, for instance, I think Liberia, I mean, there's so many examples we can list, but like countries where there was a horrific oppression top down, right? And the people who are being oppressed, even sometimes when they try to use violence, the oppressor, I mean, just overpower them, But it is shocking. I haven't double checked all his research, so I mean, I'll let people fact check this, but it is shocking how many powerful systems of oppression have been dismantled through nonviolent means, when violent means did nothing but the opposite. Now, I still do stand by, my statement in the book, and it's something you guys have said, our main goal is a faithfulness, not necessarily perceived effectiveness. I think that is ethically more superior. But at the same time, it is shocking at how often nonviolent revolts, it went on a systemic level, are actually both faithful and more effective as well. Is that valid? Did you guys talk about that? Have you verified, Sider's survey in his book?
Yeah, I don't think we did. I don't think we fact checked all of Sider's stuff. There's a couple of, and we get into a little bit of that in the book. There's a researcher that I follow named Dr. Erica Chenoweth, She's at the Coble School, the Coble School, which is in Colorado. It's part of University of Denver, I believe. But she has documented. She's done a lot of the social scientific work on this and documenting the ways in which nonviolence has been used within popular revolts or within political process. And the results are actually it's really interesting because sometimes it's nonviolence plus other factors. Sometimes it's nonviolence alone. I think if we look for nonviolence to do all of the heavy lifting, I think that you can find those examples.
Yeah.
But frequently it's nonviolence. And this again kind of touches on the realist chapter that we wrote. Frequently it's nonviolent protest in combination with other factors.
Okay.
So something like, say, the transition of power in Poland in the 1980s, we could like mythologize it and say, yeah, it was just like purely nonviolence that did this, but it was actually nonviolence in combination with international pressure and support from the church and some economics, and so it was just like this complex of factors.
Okay.
But which nonviolence did play a significant role, but maybe wasn't the only factor there.
But even those are still nonviolent, right? I mean, economic sanctions and publicity, and I mean that
gets a little dicey.
Okay.
Because then you might wonder the critique this gets to part of the ways in which some of these types might argue with one another. When you start talking about economic sanctions, then you have to ask the question, well, who's being really affected by the economic sanctions? Right. Yeah. So a liberationist perspective might push back and say, well, not so fast.
Okay.
You think that economic sanctions is a form of nonviolence, but it's actually really hurting the poorest at those at the subsistence level. Right. It's not really putting pressure on those at the top that have the most wealth to withstand it. It's really doing violence against the most vulnerable within that society.
Okay.
So
that's fair.
We do mention the story of Liberia actually in the last chapter, because that was a woman's led movement. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Pray the Devil Back to Hell, or if your listeners have ever heard of that, you got to check that out. It tells a story about how Christian and Muslim women basically combined forces nonviolently to stop the war there. And as Myles said, there's other factors going on at the same time, but it was really a women's led prayer movement that turned the tides on that war. So that's a compelling story that I think fits Ron Sider's narrative. And one thing, Sider, he's a scholar for sure, but he's also an activist who puts his action where his mouth is. And he gave a speech back in the 80s, basically saying we should be as committed to nonviolence as soldiers are to war. And out of that was a group founded called the Christian Peacemaker Teams. I think they're now called community teams, but they go around the world basically to war-torn areas to try to get in the way and to try to disrupt the violences that are happening. And that kind of goes back to Sider's influence there.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, the Liberia, was that the one where all the women said, we're not going to have sex with y'all till there's peace or something? Like there's like a sex strike or something? I thought that was creative. Oh, we lost David again. Myles, is that... I don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, I don't recall the specifics of it. That reminds me of there was a movie. What was it? It was a Spike Lee movie several years ago where he redoes Les Estrada, but that's the basic premise of it, is that there's conflict and the women decide to not have sex with any of the warriors until there's peace, and so that eventuates peace.
It's creative.
Yeah, but I don't remember the specifics of it.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna wrap things up here. I've taken you over an hour. We lost David. David is no longer with us. Hopefully he's still alive. Hopefully no one broke into his house and disconnected his internet, violated his internet. Well, dude, seriously, thank you so much for this book. I'm excited to get it, check it out, and I hope it really stirs some great conversations. I mean, that's I don't know. My audience is probably mixed. Some people were fully convinced. Others are maybe appalled that we're even talking about this. Other people are somewhere in between. The main thing is, again, it's really good to ask the question, like, what does the Bible say about this? What is a countercultural Christian view of things like violence in the face of evil, whether it's evil being done to you, done to someone else, whether it's systemic evil, whatever it is. Like, I think we do need to take seriously what the New Testament has to say about that. And I don't want to say like, therefore everybody will be right where we're at, but I mean, we do need to have this conversation, right? So I mean, I hope your book, if it doesn't convince everybody, will at least stir some really good conversations, drive people yet again back to the text and the countercultural, upside down nature of the kingdom that Jesus sought to establish, you know? So
right. Yeah, the goal of the book is just to open it up and to say the Christian Nonviolence has labored under a variety of stereotypes for far too long. And there's a whole lot of directions and a whole lot of folks that you've never heard of, but you should. And so if it's easy to dismiss it if all you have is a caricature of it.
Yeah.
So let's get down to the sources. Let's get down to the actual figures. Let them speak for themselves. And then we can have a real robust conversation. But I think by and large, it's hard to have a real robust conversation when no one knows what Christian nonviolence is.
Yeah.
That's my experience when it felt like it was very one-sided.
Yeah.
You know, there was a great deal of unawareness, I'll say, as to what Christian nonviolence entailed. So,
yeah. Good. David, you missed it, but I was
now there's no excuse.
Yeah, I was we're closing this town. I got to run, and I'm taking you over an hour. But yeah, thanks, David and Myles, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. And hope your book finds its way into many people's hands.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Take care.